August 19, 1942. Dieppe, France. Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Andrews watched his Churchill tank crawl up the seawall onto the beach promenade, tracks grinding over concrete designed to stop vehicles far less capable. Around him, Canadian infantry were pinned down by German machine gun fire from fortified positions. The raid was collapsing into catastrophe. But his tank, and the 30 others from the Calgary Regiment, represented the only armored support the assault forces would receive. The Churchill wasn't what Andrews would have chosen. It was slow. Maximum speed of 15 miles per hour meant it was barely faster than marching infantry. The gun was inadequate. The 2-pounder couldn't penetrate most German tank armor. The design was archaic. It looked more like a World War I tank than a modern fighting vehicle. But as German anti-tank guns opened fire and shells bounced off the Churchill's thick frontal armor, Andrews understood what British designers had built. This wasn't a tank designed to race across open country or duel with enemy armor. It was designed to crawl into hell alongside infantry, absorb punishment that would destroy lighter tanks, and keep moving despite obstacles and fire that should have stopped it. As his Churchill climbed obstacles that German engineers had assumed were tank-proof, as it shrugged off hits that would have killed a cruiser tank, Andrews realized the ungainly beast was doing exactly what it was designed for. By day's end, the Dieppe raid would be a disaster. Over 3,600 casualties, minimal objectives achieved, valuable lessons learned at terrible cost. But the Churchill tanks, 15 of which made it off the beach and into the town, demonstrated capabilities that would make them essential to British operations for the rest of the war. Not through speed or firepower, but through the stubborn ability to go anywhere infantry needed armor support and survive punishment that would have destroyed vehicles designed for different purposes. This is the story of the Churchill tank, the slow, heavily armored infantry support vehicle that became one of Britain's most successful tank designs, despite being obsolete by conventional standards before it entered service. It succeeded not by matching enemy tanks in speed or gun power, but by being nearly indestructible and capable of traversing terrain that stopped everything else. The Churchill was the tank that climbed hills too steep for other armor, crossed trenches too wide for German vehicles, and absorbed hits that turned other tanks into burning wrecks. To understand the Churchill, you must understand the strategic context that shaped its design. In 1940, Britain had just evacuated from Dunkirk, abandoning virtually all heavy equipment on French beaches. The British Army had left behind over 600 tanks and needed to rebuild armored forces from almost nothing. But the question of what to build was complicated by contradictory lessons from recent campaigns and limited understanding of what future armored warfare would require. British tank doctrine in 1940 was divided between two philosophies that created different requirements. Cruiser tanks were designed for exploitation and mobile operations, fast, lightly armored, intended for cavalry-style operations. Infantry tanks were designed for close support of attacking infantry, slow, heavily armored, intended to survive infantry combat's close-range threats. The two roles required different characteristics that couldn't be combined in a single design. The Churchill emerged from the infantry tank philosophy, specifically from Requirement A-20 issued in September 1939. The specification called for a tank that could cross trenches like World War I battlefields, climb steep slopes, survive hits from anti-tank guns, and support infantry in breakthrough operations. Speed was irrelevant. Infantry walked at 4 miles per hour. The tank only needed to match infantry pace. Armor and obstacle crossing were paramount. Vauxhall Motors received the contract to design and produce the A-20, which would become the Churchill. Vauxhall was an automotive manufacturer with no tank building experience, but British tank production capacity was limited, and every manufacturer that could contribute was mobilized. The design process occurred under extreme time pressure. Britain expected German invasion and needed tanks immediately. The requirement was for a functional tank quickly rather than an optimal tank eventually. The design that emerged was deliberately archaic. The Churchill used a rhomboidal hull shape reminiscent of World War I tanks, with tracks extending high up the sides. This provided maximum ground contact for obstacle crossing and trench spanning. The suspension used 11 small road wheels per side, unusual compared to the larger wheels on most tanks but providing stability and terrain crossing ability. The armor was thick but not sloped, vertical plates that were easier to manufacture quickly but less effective than angled armor. The first Churchills entered production in June 1941, barely 14 months after design began. This speed came at cost. The initial Mark I variant had serious mechanical problems. The Bedford engine, designed for commercial trucks, was inadequate for a 40-ton tank. Cooling was insufficient. The transmission was unreliable. The tracks wore out quickly. The gun, a 2-pounder intended for 1940, was already obsolete by 1941, when German tanks were being U-armored to resist it. The early Churchill's reputation suffered from these mechanical problems and inadequate armament. Units receiving the first models reported constant breakdowns, poor reliability, and frustration with the gun's inability to defeat enemy armor. Some British officers considered the Churchill a failure and advocated canceling production in favor of more conventional designs. The tank seemed to embody everything wrong with British tank development: rushed production, inadequate testing, compromised design. But dismissing the Churchill as a failure missed what the design did well. The armor was exceptional, up to 100 toom on the front of later models, thicker than any other British tank. The obstacle crossing capability was extraordinary. The Churchill could climb 35-degree slopes that stopped other tanks. It could cross trenches 10 feet wide. It could wade through water 3.5 feet deep. These capabilities seemed irrelevant until combat situations arose where they were critical. Dieppe in August 1942 provided the first real combat test. The raid was conceived as a large-scale assault to test invasion techniques and gather intelligence. 30 Calgary Regiment Churchills were landed to support Canadian infantry. The results were mixed but instructive. Many tanks were immobilized by the shingle beach, which their tracks couldn't traverse, but those that reached the promenade demonstrated remarkable capabilities that changed perceptions. Lieutenant Colonel Andrews' tank climbed the seawall, a vertical concrete obstacle over 3 feet high that German defenders had assumed was tank-proof. The Churchill's center of gravity and long track base allowed it to simply crawl over obstacles that would have stopped conventional tanks. Once in the town, Churchills engaged German positions, absorbing hits from anti-tank weapons while suppressing defensive positions with machine gun and cannon fire. The Dieppe Churchills took extraordinary punishment. One tank recorded over 20 hits from anti-tank guns, including several that penetrated the hull, yet remained mobile enough to withdraw when the raid was called off. Another survived a direct hit from a field gun that would have destroyed lighter tanks. The crews discovered what the thick armor meant in practical terms. They could be hit repeatedly and survive long enough to accomplish missions or withdraw. The raid was a disaster overall, but the Churchill's performance was noted. The tanks that made it off the beach had performed their infantry support role effectively. They had crossed obstacles German engineers considered impassable. They had survived punishment that would have destroyed every other British tank in service. The gun was inadequate and the mobility was poor, but the fundamental design concept, a heavily armored vehicle that could go anywhere infantry needed support, was validated. The mechanical problems were addressed through continuous improvement. The Mark III, entering production in early 1942, replaced the 2-pounder with a 6-pounder gun, not ideal but more capable. More critically, the engine and transmission were improved, increasing reliability substantially. The Mark IV, entering service in late 1942, featured the welded turret and improved suspension that addressed earlier weaknesses. Each variant incorporated lessons from previous models and combat feedback. By 1943, the Churchill had evolved from problem-plagued failure to reliable infantry support vehicle. The mechanical issues that plagued early models had been largely resolved. The gun, while still inadequate against German heavy tanks, was sufficient for infantry support missions, and the armor and obstacle crossing capabilities that had always been the design's strengths were increasingly valued as operations moved into terrain where those capabilities mattered. The Churchill's finest hour came in Tunisia during the spring 1943 campaign. The mountainous terrain that characterized much of the Tunisian battlefield was nightmare for conventional tanks. Steep slopes, narrow valleys, and limited roads meant that fast cruiser tanks couldn't exploit their mobility. Infantry advancing through mountains needed armored support, but the terrain seemed impassable to armor. The Churchill's climbing ability became decisive advantage. At the Battle of Longstop Hill in April 1943, Churchills from the North Irish Horse supported infantry attacking German positions on slopes that other tanks couldn't climb. The Churchills crawled up inclines that German defenders had assumed were safe from armor, bringing direct fire support to altitudes where only infantry could normally operate. The psychological impact on German troops, seeing tanks appear where tanks shouldn't be able to reach, was as important as the firepower they provided. The Hunt's Gap action demonstrated the Churchill's durability under fire. A troop of 3 Churchills engaged German positions at close range, absorbing dozens of hits from anti-tank weapons. All 3 were hit multiple times. None were destroyed. One Churchill recorded over 40 hits on its armor, including several penetrations, yet remained mobile enough to withdraw when ammunition was exhausted. The crew's survivability in a Churchill was substantially higher than in lighter British tanks. By mid-1943, the Churchill was being produced in several specialized variants that exploited its unique capabilities. The Churchill AVRE, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, mounted a 290 petard mortar for demolishing fortifications. The Churchill Crocodile was a flamethrower tank with range exceeding 100 yards. Churchill Bridgelayers, recovery vehicles, and mine clearers all leveraged the robust chassis and obstacle crossing ability. The tank that had started as a problematic infantry support vehicle had become a multi-role platform. The D-Day landings in June 1944 saw extensive Churchill employment in specialized roles. AVREs breached beach obstacles and destroyed German fortifications. Crocodiles cleared bunkers with flame that conventional weapons couldn't suppress. Churchill Bridgelayers provided crossing capability over obstacles that would have stopped Allied advances. The diversity of Churchill variants demonstrated how the robust, reliable chassis could support missions beyond its original infantry support role. The Churchill's gun problem was partially addressed in the Mark VII variant, which mounted a 75 gun, the same caliber as American Shermans. This wasn't ideal for tank combat, but it provided infantry support capability with more effective high-explosive shells than the 6-pounder. The Mark VII also featured improved armor, with frontal protection reaching 152 thicker than most German tanks except the heaviest Tigers and Jagdtigers. The tank had evolved from undergun failure to specialized heavy infantry tank. The contrast with other British tanks highlighted the Churchill's unique niche. Cromwell cruiser tanks were faster and more maneuverable, but lacked the Churchill's armor and obstacle crossing. Shermans provided better all-round performance but couldn't match the Churchill's protection or climbing ability. The Churchill wasn't the best tank for open warfare or mobile operations, but for infantry support in difficult terrain under heavy fire, it was unsurpassed. The Italian campaign from 1940–1945 provided ideal conditions for Churchill employment. The mountainous Italian terrain, where much fighting occurred on slopes and narrow valleys, favored the Churchill's climbing ability over speed. British forces advancing up the Italian peninsula relied heavily on Churchill support for attacks on German defensive positions sited on terrain that seemed impassable to armor. The tank's reputation transformed from liability to essential asset. The Gothic Line fighting in late 1944 demonstrated the Churchill at its most effective. German defensive positions in the Apennine Mountains were sighted on terrain so steep that German commanders assumed armor couldn't support attacks. Churchill tanks climbed slopes approaching 40 degrees, appearing behind German positions that had been considered secure. The tactical surprise of armor arriving where it shouldn't be able to reach repeatedly disrupted German defenses. The Churchill's survivability became legendary among crews who valued armor over speed. Accounts from Churchill crews describe tanks hit dozens of times continuing to fight. The thick armor meant that many hits didn't penetrate, and even hits that did penetrate often didn't cause catastrophic damage. Crew casualties in Churchills were substantially lower than in lighter tanks. The psychological confidence this provided, knowing your tank could absorb punishment, affected crew performance and morale positively. The comparison with German heavy tanks is instructive. The Tiger I, entering service around the same time as improved Churchill variants, had superior firepower and comparable armor. But the Tiger was complex, mechanically unreliable, and difficult to produce. Germany built about 1,300 Tigers during the war. Britain produced over 5,600 Churchills. The numerical advantage allowed Churchills to be wherever infantry needed armor support, while Tigers were concentrated at specific points and often absent where they were needed. The Churchill's production rate reflected its relatively simple design and established manufacturing base. Vauxhall Motors and other contractors could produce Churchills reliably once early mechanical problems were resolved. The tank's mechanical simplicity, compared to more sophisticated designs, meant maintenance in the field was manageable. Crews could perform basic repairs without specialized equipment. The operational readiness rate for Churchill units was consistently higher than for more complex British tanks. The specialized variants demonstrate the Churchill's versatility and the British Army's recognition of its value. Beyond the AVRE and Crocodile, there were Churchill Arcs, tanks without turrets used as mobile bridges. Churchill Kangaroos, turretless variants for armored personnel transport. Churchill Oaks, experimental fascine carriers. Each variant exploited the reliable chassis and obstacle crossing ability for specialized roles. The Churchill became a platform for engineering and support vehicles, as much as a fighting tank. The flamethrower Crocodile variant deserves particular attention. The Churchill's armor and reliability made it ideal for carrying the flamethrower equipment and towing the armored fuel trailer. The Crocodile could advance into close range under heavy fire, distances where lighter tanks would be destroyed, and employ flame that was devastating against fortifications and infantry. The psychological impact of the Crocodile was substantial. German troops facing the prospect of being burned alive often surrendered rather than fight. The Northwest Europe campaign from June 1944 to May 1945 saw Churchills employed across the front in various roles. Infantry support remained primary, but the specialized variants, AVREs for obstacle clearing, Crocodiles for bunker destruction, bridge layers for river crossings, were essential to maintaining Allied advance through prepared German defenses. The Churchill wasn't glamorous, but it was indispensable for the methodical reduction of German resistance. The Rhine crossing operations in March 1945 demonstrated multiple Churchill variants working together. AVREs breached obstacles. Bridge layers provided crossing capability. Crocodiles suppressed bunkers. Standard gun tanks provided infantry support. The integration of multiple Churchill variants into combined arms operations showed how the platform had evolved from single-purpose infantry tank to versatile system supporting multiple missions simultaneously. The Churchill's post-war service extended far beyond World War II. The robust design and available numbers meant Churchills remained in British service through the early 1950s. They saw combat in Korea, where the terrain again favored the Churchill's climbing ability. The tank was exported to Ireland, which operated Churchills until the 1960s. Some specialized variants remained in service even longer. Churchill ARVs, armored recovery vehicles, served into the 1960s because the robust chassis was ideal for vehicle recovery missions. The comparison with contemporary tank development reveals interesting design philosophy differences. American and German tank development increasingly emphasized speed, mobility, and firepower, characteristics valuable for mobile warfare. British development, particularly with the Churchill, prioritized protection and obstacle crossing, characteristics valuable for infantry support in varied terrain. Neither approach was inherently superior, but they reflected different tactical priorities and operational requirements. The Churchill's climbing ability, which seemed like specialized capability of limited use, proved valuable far more often than designers expected. Warfare in Europe and Italy repeatedly occurred in terrain where steep slopes and obstacles channeled movement. Tanks that could only operate on relatively flat ground were confined to predictable routes that enemy defenses could cover. Tanks that could climb anywhere infantry could go provided tactical flexibility that multiplied their effectiveness beyond what specifications suggested. The armor thickness, which made the Churchill slow and limited its armament, saved thousands of crew lives over the war's course. Tank combat was always risky, but Churchill crews had survival rates substantially higher than crews in lighter tanks. The difference between walking away from a knocked-out tank and dying inside it was often determined by armor thickness measured in millimeters. The Churchill's designers had prioritized crew protection, and that priority was vindicated in combat. The gun inadequacy, which was the Churchill's most frequently criticized feature, reflected the fundamental tension between competing design requirements. A tank cannot be heavily armored, carry a large gun, and be fast simultaneously. Physics and engineering impose trade-offs. The Churchill sacrificed gun power and speed for protection and obstacle crossing. For its designed role, infantry support, this was appropriate. For tank versus tank combat, it was problematic. But British forces generally avoided using Churchills in tank duels, employing them where their strengths were relevant. The specialized variants addressed some gun inadequacy through different weapon systems. The AVRE's petard mortar delivered enormous high-explosive charges that could destroy virtually any fortification. The Crocodile's flamethrower was devastating against infantry and bunkers at close range. These weapons weren't suitable for all situations, but they were highly effective for specific missions. The Churchill platform's versatility allowed mounting different weapons for different roles, turning the basic chassis into a multi-role system. The production numbers, over 5,600 units, made the Churchill Britain's second most produced tank of the war after the Valentine. This wasn't because the Churchill was the best British tank by conventional measures. It was because the combination of established production, reliability, and specialized capabilities made it valuable enough to continue producing even as newer designs became available. The Churchill filled roles that other tanks couldn't, making it indispensable despite its limitations. The crew perspective on the Churchill was generally positive despite the tank's shortcomings. Crews appreciated the armor that kept them alive. They valued the reliability that meant their tank would start and continue running. They respected the obstacle crossing that allowed them to support infantry anywhere. They were frustrated by the gun's limitations and the slow speed, but they understood the design trade-offs and generally felt the compromises favored their survival over theoretical combat effectiveness. The maintenance crew's perspective was equally important. The Churchill was simpler to maintain than many contemporary tanks. The suspension, with its many small road wheels, was labor-intensive to maintain but robust and reliable. The engine and transmission, after early problems were resolved, required less maintenance than more sophisticated power plants. The robust construction meant the tank could absorb damage and rough handling without critical failures. For mechanics keeping tanks operational in field conditions, these characteristics mattered enormously. The strategic impact of the Churchill was subtle but real. The tank didn't win any single battle through dominant performance, but it enabled operations that wouldn't have been possible with other armor. Infantry assaults on steep slopes, attacks on fortified positions, river crossings under fire, obstacle clearing under direct fire. All these operations depended on the Churchill's specific capabilities. The cumulative effect over years of operations was that British forces could attack in situations where armor support would otherwise have been impossible. The comparison with American tank philosophy is revealing. American doctrine emphasized mobility and firepower, producing tanks like the Sherman that were fast, reliable, and adequately armed. The Sherman was arguably a better general-purpose tank than the Churchill, but there were situations where the Churchill's specialized capabilities, extreme armor, obstacle crossing, made it more valuable than the more balanced Sherman. The two philosophies weren't contradictory but complementary, with each tank excelling in different circumstances. The post-war assessment by military historians has generally been favorable toward the Churchill despite its unimpressive specifications. The tank succeeded in its designed role of infantry support, which was what mattered. It was produced in numbers sufficient to be available when needed. It was reliable enough to be operationally useful, and it had specialized capabilities that made it uniquely valuable for specific missions. These practical virtues outweighed specification weaknesses. The final accounting must acknowledge the Churchill's contradictions. It was slow but climbed anywhere. It was heavily armored but undergunned. It looked archaic but incorporated modern features. It was considered a failure in 1942 but was indispensable by 1944. The contradictions reflected the inherent tension in its design requirements and the difficulty of predicting what characteristics would prove most valuable in combat. The Churchill succeeded because British forces found ways to employ it where its strengths were relevant. Infantry support in difficult terrain, assault engineering, specialized missions where armor and obstacle crossing mattered more than speed or gun power. These missions were critical to Allied operations, even if they weren't the glamorous tank versus tank combat that dominated popular imagination. The Churchill's contribution was enabling missions that other tanks couldn't accomplish. When Lieutenant Colonel Andrews climbed out of his Churchill at Dieppe in August 1942, his tank had taken multiple hits but remained functional. The raid had been a disaster, but his tank had done exactly what it was designed to do: support infantry under fire in difficult circumstances, absorb punishment that would have destroyed lighter vehicles, and provide mobile firepower where it was needed. The Churchill's limitations, slow speed, inadequate gun, hadn't mattered in circumstances where armor and obstacle crossing were paramount. That pattern would repeat throughout the war. In situations where speed was critical or long-range tank combat occurred, the Churchill was mediocre. In situations where infantry needed armored support climbing hills, crossing obstacles, or surviving heavy fire, the Churchill was unsurpassed. British commanders learned to employ the tank where its strengths were relevant and avoid situations where its weaknesses were exposed. This selective employment turned a flawed design into an effective weapon. The Churchill was Britain's infantry support beast, slow, heavily armored, capable of going anywhere infantry could go and surviving punishment that destroyed other tanks. It wasn't the best British tank by most measures, but for the specific role it was designed for, supporting infantry in close combat through difficult terrain, it was precisely what was needed. The success wasn't in the specifications but in the combination of design features that, while individually unimpressive, together created a vehicle that accomplished missions other tanks couldn't. That was the Churchill's legacy, not brilliance but specialized effectiveness where it mattered most.